Whoa. Okay. So we're going to do quick endocrine system. So we have three systems that you are responsible for: the endocrine system, the nervous system, and the immune system. So you should know the basics about some of the other ones, like the digestive system and circulatory system. You should know, for example, how oxygen's exchanged and carbon dioxide's exchanged. You should understand kind of like the very basics of gills. You should understand some of those concepts that we did in the student presentations, but really these are the three systems that I will focus on in my cumulative, and I'm pretty sure these are the three that will be focused on the AP as well. For the endocrine system, we are talking about a bunch of glands. So the endocrine system is all of the animal's hormone secreting cells. Here are the ones. We have the pituitary gland. We all know what that looks like. Pineal gland, ovaries and testes, pancreas, thyroid, thymus, and adrenal glands, which sit right on top of the kidney. Hormones, again, are chemical signals that are secreted and carried out through the blood, through the circulatory system. So obviously there's a tight connection between the endocrine system and the circulatory system. These are these regulate longer term responses. And remember, like any signal, in order for a cell to respond, it must have the appropriate receptor, right? And receptors are proteins that would bind the hormone, right? And remember, the hormones, depending on what they are, they might have internal or external receptors. There are these four kinds of signaling: autocrine, going to the self; paracrine, nearby; endocrine, through the blood system; or neurocrine, neurons releasing neurohormones into the blood system. And the hypothalamus is really important in neurocrine signaling. So simple endocrine pathways result from a stimulus that results in hormone release into the blood. Target cells then have receptor binding, and then you get a cellular response. Very often you have feedback with endocrine systems. In this example, we have a negative feedback situation where the response is going to be to turn off that stimulus. An example is for temperature regulation. There's also a few examples of positive stimulation or positive feedback, where again we have a stimulus. Here we have a neuron inducing a neurohormone that's in the hypothalamus, going out of the posterior pituitary in the brain, going into the blood system. Again, target cell must have a receptor for that particular hormone, and then you get a cellular response. In this case, it is milk release, as in breastfeeding. And here, the response then feeds back and increases that stimulus. And these are the few examples of positive feedback that we talk about: breastfeeding, giving birth, those type. So there's two main types of hormones, just like there are two main types of ligands, rather. So we have here water-soluble hormones, meaning they're proteins or they're large polar molecules. They go through the blood system, and you have to have a cell surface receptor in order on that target cell in order to receive the signal. Lipid-soluble hormones, such as the steroids, can diffuse right through the plasma membrane, down their concentration gradients. These often go directly into the nucleus, where they act as transcription factors with their receptors. Again, when you induce transcription, you are making mRNA, which then can be translated into protein to give you whatever cellular response it is. So maintaining homeostasis is very important with the endocrine system. So the nervous system responds to a stimulus, an external environment, and the endocrine system helps communicate all of those messages, right? And very often this is through negative feedback, trying to maintain a set point or maintain a constant internal environment, right? And that really is kind of homeostasis, maintaining an internal environment. We just have lots of examples of different kinds of feedback. Here we have temperature feedback. A couple things to think about. That again, the hypothalamus is the activates a heat loss center. So this is kind of a temperature regulator, is the hypothalamus, which then can stimulate to, send signals to capillaries and skin to reduce body temperature or to increase body temperature. But the hypothalamus is really kind of that heat center. So the hypothalamus and pituitary really work together. There's a hypothalamus that sits right on top of this unfortunate looking pituitary. The pituitary gland has two regions, an anterior posterior and a anterior pituitary and a posterior pituitary, and they have different functions and different hormones that are released from each. The hypothalamus is the neurocrine, sends neurocrine signals to the pituitary. So here in the hypothalamus, we have neurosecretory cells that release neurocrine signals in those capillaries, which then go through the pituitary and out into the blood flow. So the anterior and the posterior pituitary have different functions. The ones that we have talked about are growth hormones, regulating growth and metabolism, and then adrenocorticotropic hormone, which triggers adrenals to release cortisol, which is a really important stress hormone. Posterior pituitary, the two that we've really spoken about are oxytocin, which is involved in contractions in the uterus and the mammary gland, and sometimes thought of as the love drug, gives you all the warm fuzzies. And then we also have antidiuretic hormone, which is involved in water retention or urine production. This is just to show you that problems with these hormones can result in very dramatic phenotypes. Just want to give you one quick example of ADH, which is the antidiuretic hormone, right? So this regulates water homeostasis. So if you have too low of water, again, your hypothalamus is one of these centers that kind of detects that in your blood, and then what it will do is through the posterior pituitary release more ADH, and that will allow the person to drink more water and stimulate more reabsorption of water. If you have too little water, again, hypothalamus detects it through the posterior pituitary, release less ADH or antidiuretic hormone so that your kidneys will reabsorb less water. And again, alcohol also inhibits ADH. So if you have less ADH, right, then you are going to reabsorb less water and you're going to then increase urine production. So you're going to pee out a lot of your liquids. The pancreas is really important because it has this little region called the islets of Langerhans, where really what you need to know about the pancreas is it is involved in glucose regulation. So you can secrete glucagon, which will break down glycogen. Glucagon breaks down glycogen. And then you have insulin, which will cause you to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. Insulin, you take it in. Glucagon, you break it down. All right, and there's lots of regulation here. I'm not going to go into the details of it here, but if you have low glucose, then you're going to secrete glucagon to make more. If you have high glucose, you're going to secrete insulin to store that as glycogen. Diabetes are some diseases related to glucose regulation issues. If you too much glucose in the blood, you start peeing out glucose, and that's one of the tests for insulin. Makes you very, very thirsty. You have a lot of urine, right? So type 1, the pancreas fails to produce insulin at all, right? And that can be regulated by injections of insulin after you eat to make sure your glucose can then get converted to glycogen. Then type 2 is where the cells just don't respond to the insulin. The adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys like little yarmulkes. The important signals here are epinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline, for fight or flight, right? And so epinephrine is really important for releasing releasing glucose from from glycogen and involves in heart rate, blood pressure, all of those things where you feel that burst of adrenaline. Right? If you have a long-term stress, that is through another hormone called cortisol, and that's really in longer-term stress. And you have to be really careful. There's some research showing that long-term cortisol can have some real negative effects. The pineal gland is this teeny tiny little pinecone shaped gland, and it secretes melatonin. And so thymus produces T cells, which are really important in the immune system, and the thyroid is involved in regulating calcium homeostasis. Ovaries and testes, also really important endocrine hormones. Testes are going to be giving off testosterone, ovaries are going to be giving estrogen and progesterone, right? And remember, testosterone and estrogen are, oh, did you just step in cat puke? Someone did. Sorry, guys. These are all cholesterol-based, meaning they do not need an extracellular receptor. They can go right through the plasma membrane. All right, so with all of these endocrine systems, the most likely scenario on a test is that I would give you data and say, okay, here's a hormone that you've never heard of. It comes through the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and I'd show you some data, and you'd have to kind of logic that out. I'm not going to ask you a question like, what is the main hormone produced by the pineal gland? I'm not going to ask you those memorizing type questions. It's really going to be more a synthesis of your knowledge.